Today we're going to continue talking about rigidity and critical scholars of the Gospels and how they are, in fact, very rigid, very inclined to all or nothing thinking. And I've given examples of this as we've been going along. Today I'm going to talk about what I call the rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence. The rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence. Roughly, here is how this rigid rule goes. If the stories in the Synoptic Gospels, if a particular story in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is worded similarly in those Gospels, and if you conclude that one or more of those Gospels was making use of an earlier source, for example, that Matthew and Luke are making use of Mark, then variations of truthful witness testimony are irrelevant to explaining the differences in the stories. So the differences then have to be the result of some kind of manipulation of Mark without separate factual input. Because after all, we know, supposedly, that Matthew is using Mark. And so if Matthew's using Mark, then if Matthew differs somewhat from Mark, we should assume that he's doing it aside from any separate factual access to the facts, separate witness access, and the same way for Luke. Now, this is an all or nothing rigid rule because it involves the assumption that the synoptic accounts of a given incident cannot be partially dependent in the sense that, say, Matthew is using Mark for some of his wording, or Luke is using Mark for some of his wording, or maybe Matthew and Luke are using some other source, which is hypothetical, but, something like Q, for their wording, but at the same time that Matthew and or Luke has some separate access to what really happened, to where he is actually able to bring in a variation in wording or an additional fact that isn't mentioned in that other source, and it's true. He's bringing it in because he actually knows it. This is particularly surprising to find in scholars who supposedly believe in traditional authorship, because, of course, if Matthew was a disciple, he could have been present, so why couldn't he have had additional factual information? Why should we take it that when he's using Mark, he's signed some kind of contract that he's not going to add some more factual information that he knows while partially using Mark as what we sometimes call a pony, something that you're kind of using to help you as you're writing? Why? Why not, if he's Matthew? Or if Luke is a companion of the Apostle Paul and had opportunity to meet the disciples, why couldn't Luke be talking to someone else who was there and be adding some real factual information to the story rather than just redacting Mark in a non-factual way? Why not? Now, it's more understandable in someone like Bart Ehrman or Dale Allison or one of these guys who just rejects traditional authorship, because of course they're not going to bring that in. But it's more surprising to find a scholar who claims to accept traditional authorship who adheres to this same rigid rule. Now, to see that this rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence is wrong and that we should not adopt it, let me give you an ordinary example. Suppose that you and a friend are in a car and he's driving and you're in an accident. And suppose that sometime within the statute of limitations, the driver of the other car sues your friend for physical harm that has occurred to him supposedly within this accident. So your friend's insurance company steps forward to defend him, and you're brought in as a second person and your friend is brought in, and both of you are deposed. To be deposed is to be, making a promise to tell the truth, but you're not actually in the trial. But you're still promising to tell the truth, and then someone makes a record of what you say, and you have to answer questions and so forth that are put to you, especially by the opposing attorney. Why are you both deposed? You're friends. You were there together at the time of the accident. In the intervening time, whatever it might be, I mean, it's not, you're not being deposed within an hour of the accident. You haven't been locked up in separate rooms and prohibited to have any contact with one another between the time of the accident and the time of the deposition. Why are we bothering to depose both of you? Because it's plausible that your testimony is partially independent, even though it's undoubtedly partially dependent. And lawyers realize that they may pick up some additional information that's actually true, okay, from deposing both people, even though they've been in contact with one another. They have not been what's called witness separated in between. And some degree of dependence is actually quite plausible. You and your friend have probably discussed the accident. Depending on how long the time has been, you may have influenced one another's memories, may have even non-factually, accidentally influenced one another's memories. Like, was he stopped in front of you when you drove into him or not? Well, I thought he was stopped. Oh, really? Etc. I guess he was, So we might even say somewhat corrupted one another's memories by talking. So there's not going to be complete independence here. And there may even be a more factually benign kind of dependence. Maybe you think that your friend has put something especially well about what the guy was doing in the other car, or the way that it looked, or how it felt when you hit each other, or something like that. And you like his wording, and so you use his wording, even though you also accurately remember that it did happen like that. Okay, so there can be various kinds of dependence, and it's plausible that there is some dependence. So why not just, pick one person, the driver, let's say, and depose him and not bother with the other guy? Because, they're probably dependent anyway. We're not going to get anything useful by deposing both of them. But that wouldn't be reasonable, would it? Because you and your friend do both have memories. You may even disagree about certain things. You may even contradict each other because you are convinced that you have factual independence. Now, if you're literally contradicting each other, one of you has to be wrong, but it's not arising from some kind of redaction, like, I know it didn't happen that way, but I'm going to change it. Nothing like that. You can both be completely in good faith. Or you could remember things that were said at the accident when the other guy got out of the car. Or you can remember what he looked like, or what he seemed to be like physically, whether he seemed to be hurt or not, specifics that your friend doesn't remember, and vice versa. Okay? So it's not all or nothing. It's not either or. If someone says, well, you're dependent on your friend's account, should we then say, let's not take variations in truthful witness testimony to account for the differences between you? No, that would be a loss of common sense. That would be an incorrect epistemological approach. We should, in fact, consider it pretty plausible that there might be variations of truthful witness testimony between the two of you. So now let me read an example of a statement of this rigid rule, and this comes from Dr. Mike Lacona's recent book, Jesus Contradicted. And I want to note here that Dr. Lacona supposedly believes in Matthew and traditional authorship, that Matthew was actually a disciple of Jesus and wrote Matthew. So it's all the more odd that he would accept this rule. So he's talking about the case of Jairus' daughter, the story of Jairus' daughter, and I think I'm probably going to do a video about that next week. and show how we don't need to be tied to this rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence in that story. But this is a more general comment. And this is from the Kindle edition, page 110, from Jesus Contradicted. Furthermore, in chapter 3, we observe that a relationship exists between the Synoptic Gospels, with Matthew and Luke making robust use of Mark as their primary source. So when Matthew differs from Mark in such minor ways, it's quite probable that Matthew, or more likely the secretary assisting him, was either intentionally providing additional details, something not present in this story, he means the story of Jairus' daughter, paraphrasing, or correcting Mark. Thus, when Matthew and Luke are likely using Mark, an appeal to variations of truthful witness memory should not be the default approach to understanding why such similarities are present in the Synoptic Gospels. So, just want to note, there's his summary. All right? And I want to just state that just saying that it should not be the default approach does not really adequately express the practical opposition on the part of Dr. Licona and others to traditional harmonizations based upon variations of truthful witness memory. They resist them far more than would be accurately described by saying, well, it's not the default approach. Okay, so when is it not the correct approach? When they think Matthew's using Mark, they're usually very resistant. I'm not going to say never do they allow for Matthew to have additional information that's accurate, but they're very resistant to it, and they do apply it, very strongly. But I mean, it just doesn't follow, okay, that we should be to even any significant extent opposed to thinking in terms of variation of truthful witness memory, because as in the case of you and your friend, even if your accounts are quite similar, even if the differences are quite minor, those differences could easily arise from variations of truthful witness memory. You could remember what that other driver said when he got out of the car and when you were talking after the accident somewhat differently than your friend remembers it, and they might even be harmonizable. They might even both be true. Okay, maybe he said two different things that were somewhat similar, but not exactly the same. So it doesn't support a presumption against it if we're treating it as in any sense a live option that we actually have variations of truthful witness memory. In fact, variations of truthful witness memory often are pretty minor. That's because they're truthful, okay? Notice, too, that this statement about providing additional details together with the thus and opposing variations of truthful witness memory appears to me that these are probably not additional true details. And you'll find, for example, I saw an interview with Dr. Craig Keener one time. He was talking about the story of the man with the withered hand. And he suggested that Luke simply invented, he didn't use the word invention, but that's what he was talking about, invented the statement which hand it was. I think it's the right hand in Luke's version. Just to kind of, whatever, make the story more interesting or whatever. In other words, that Luke didn't actually have a truthful, separate source that told him that it really was the right hand. Okay, so putting in additional details isn't going to mean truthful details if you're not willing to rely on variations of truthful witness memory. I would also notice that these are not necessarily always minor. Now, I have emphasized that deliberately changing even minor factual details has epistemic importance, and I've talked about that elsewhere, saying, I know that he didn't say this at the time, but I'm going to try to make it look like he did because I want to shorten the story or whatever it might be. For example, I know that Jesus didn't give his Sermon on the Mount on the Mount. Now you may say, well, it's a minor detail whether he was on a mountain or on a plain down at the bottom of the mountains. I don't actually think that's all that minor. But if Matthew made that up, as Dr. Licona takes it to be, to make Jesus look more like Moses because he goes up onto a mountain, that does influence your notion of Matthew's commitment to truth, that in order to make some kind of theological commitment come through, some kind of theological symbolism, he's going to make something up that he knows for a fact is not really the way that it was, and then he's going to narrate it seamlessly. But these aren't even all what I think anyone should call or would call minor. To give another example from Dr. Keener concerning the blind men in Matthew 9. So that's a healing of 2 blind men early in Matthew 9. Then there's a healing of 2 different blind men to a completely different point in Jesus' ministry in Matthew 20. Dr. Keener thinks that it's very plausible that, or at least he did when he wrote his Matthew commentary, I'll put it that way, and referred to it in his recent book, Christobiography, in a way that seems to indicate he still thinks it, that Matthew just made that up, that earlier story, to quote-unquote compensate for the fact that he's not telling some other stories about blind men being healed. And so I call this the, game token view, that we've, like on some kind of a board game, you've got a certain number of little plastic blind men tokens, with their eyes closed or their eyes X'd out or something. And you're like, okay, in Mark, the game tokens of blind men are here and here, and they're in different contexts, different cities, like, for example, outside of Bethsaida, which is a healing of a blind man that Matthew doesn't tell. So I'm going to take that blind man game token and this blind man game token. I'm going to move them here, and I'm going to make up an incident because I've got the same number of blind men game tokens. That's not minor. That's the invention of an entire incident, if you think about it clearly. So these ideas of how Matthew might have used Mark definitely are not confined to just things that would be called minor. This rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence results in a rejection pretty much a priori of undesigned coincidences among the synoptics, even when they are plausible. Some years ago, Dr. Licona and Kurt Jaros did a thing on, I think it was on Veracity Hill, on undesigned coincidences among the synoptics. And the message was very clear that if you understand the synoptic problem, you're not going to try to make undesigned coincidences between the synoptics. You're going to try to find some other explanation. And if you accept that there are specific undesigned coincidences between the synoptics, and you must just not understand the synoptic problem. So this leads to these myths, definitely myths, or perhaps I should call them legends, sort of mythological Lydia and Tim McGrew who don't understand the synoptic problem, who've never heard of the synoptic problem, or they don't take it into account, and so forth. I discuss explicitly the synoptic problem in Hidden in Plain View, even more in The Mirror of the Mask, and the synoptic problem in relation to undesigned coincidences in Fresh Content in Testimony to the Truth. And there's nothing about the notion of synoptic dependence of some kind that says that we should reject undesigned coincidences more or less out of hand and find some other, explanation for any apparent undesigned coincidence, as long as you don't adopt the rigid rule of all or nothing factual independence. Nothing in the argument from undesigned coincidences states that you have to have these people witness separated, or else you can't have an undesigned coincidence. It's much more nuanced than that. There can be degrees of independence. There can be degrees of strength of undesigned coincidences. There can be all kinds of different nuances to this. And so even though, for example, Matthew's story about the beheading of John the Baptist has wording that's quite similar to the wording of Mark's, I believe there's still an undesigned coincidence there, and quite a strong one, in fact. And some of the similar wording concerns the lead-in to that, where Herod, the Tetrarch, thinks that Jesus might be John the Baptist risen from the dead. Okay, and in Matthew he says that to his servants, and only Matthew mentions that he says that to his servants. And then you get a flashback telling the story of his beheading John the Baptist, which helps to explain why, he's thinking about John the Baptist right now. Maybe he has a guilty conscience or something. But the wording in Matthew and Mark is very similar, but only Matthew as to his servants. And we have a confirmation that Matthew could have known what Herod the Tetrarch was saying to his servants from the book of Luke, in Luke 8, where he mentions that Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, was in fact a follower of Jesus. And I would say, therefore, plausibly, Chuza was as well, because of the, social norms governing married women at the time. But the point is that he could tell Joanna something, Joanna can tell it to the Christians, and this is how Matthew could know. So it's not just something Matthew's inventing and throwing in there as a vivid detail that he's just making up, that Herod's speaking to his sermons, and then he goes back to just rigidly copying Mark. Even if he is partially copying Mark, he has independent information. So this rigid rule affects our perception of the evidence in the Gospels, and I think we should not bind ourselves to that rigid rule. Scholars need to avoid that kind of all or nothing thinking on dependence. They need to avoid, dare I say, that kind of black and white thinking on independence. They need to recognize the nuances that arise from how things happen in truthful witness testimony and in the real world, and consider that to be a at least possible source of these differences among the synoptics. And by at least possible, I don't just mean, barely logically possible, but a plausible source of these differences between the synoptics. In fact, I would go so far as to say that variations in wording that scholars often hang a lot on are at least some evidence in and of themselves that the other synoptic gospels have some independent information that they're bringing to the table, and they need to be more open to that. Next time, I think I'm probably going to talk about common sense and the story of Jairus' daughter, and show how this rigidity in thinking about dependence and independence is closing scholars' minds to plausible scenarios. So I hope you'll come back next time. And please like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.